September 16, 2023 will be remembered as the day West Africa declared its independence from Western military control. In a historic ceremony in Niamey, Niger, 3 military leaders signed a document that would fundamentally alter the balance of power across the Sahel. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, Colonel Assimi Goïta of Mali, and General Abdourahmane Chiani of Niger established the Alliance of Sahel States, creating what would become NATO's biggest nightmare in Africa. The timing was perfect. Niger had just experienced its own military takeover in July 2023, with popular support for the new government overwhelming international criticism. When ECOWAS, the West African Economic Bloc, threatened military intervention to restore the previous regime, Mali and Burkina Faso immediately pledged to defend their neighbor. The crisis revealed the deep fractures within the regional organization and the growing resistance to foreign interference. The Liptako Gurma charter that established the alliance was deliberately modeled on NATO's Article 5, creating a mutual defense pact that declared an attack on one member state as an attack on all. The 3 leaders had studied international law carefully, ensuring their new alliance operated within recognized diplomatic frameworks while completely undermining Western influence in the region. What made this development so shocking to international observers was the sophisticated strategic thinking behind it. These weren't isolated military coups. They represented a coordinated Pan-African movement led by young officers who had grown up witnessing the failures of Western intervention. All 3 leaders drew inspiration from legendary African revolutionaries like Thomas Sankara, Kwame Nkrumah, and Amilcar Cabral. The economic implications were immediately apparent. Combined, the 3 nations controlled vast mineral wealth, including Niger's crucial uranium reserves that powered French nuclear reactors, Mali's gold deposits, and Burkina Faso's growing agricultural output. By coordinating their resource policies, they could leverage their natural wealth for genuine development rather than foreign enrichment. Intelligence agencies across Western capitals scrambled to understand how they had missed such a significant development. The 3 military governments had been communicating through secure channels for months, coordinating their responses to international pressure and sharing strategies for achieving genuine sovereignty. Their collaboration exposed the shallow nature of previous regional cooperation frameworks that had been dominated by foreign interests. The alliance's first major test came immediately. ECOWAS imposed harsh economic sanctions on Niger and threatened military intervention to restore the previous government. The response from Mali and Burkina Faso was swift and unequivocal. They would defend Niger against any external aggression, effectively creating a 70 million person buffer against Western military intervention. Social media across Africa exploded with support for the new alliance. Young Africans, who represented the majority of the continent's 1.4 billion people, rallied behind leaders who spoke their language of sovereignty and self-determination. The median age in Africa was just 19 years, meaning most citizens had no emotional connection to colonial-era arrangements or NATO's Cold War legacy. The alliance's formation sent immediate shockwaves through European Union headquarters in Brussels. Officials who had spent years crafting Sahel security strategies watched their carefully constructed regional partnerships collapse in a matter of weeks. The G5 Sahel framework, which had been central to EU engagement with the region, effectively ceased to exist as 3 of its 5 members joined the new alliance. What truly terrified Western strategists was the alliance's explicit rejection of the terrorism narrative that had justified foreign military presence. The 3 leaders argued that jihadist violence had actually increased during the period of international intervention, pointing to statistical evidence showing that terrorism indices had worsened dramatically since NATO's intervention in Libya in 2011. By creating the Alliance of Sahel States, the 3 young leaders had achieved something unprecedented. They had established the first successful challenge to NATO's Africa strategy, creating an alternative security architecture based on African sovereignty rather than foreign dependence. The psychological impact across the continent was immediate and far-reaching. The alliance represented more than just military cooperation. It embodied a new vision of African unity, based on shared experiences of colonial exploitation and neo-colonial manipulation. The 3 leaders had identified their common enemies and decided to face them together, creating a powerful symbol of resistance that inspired similar movements across the continent. As news of the alliance spread globally, it became clear that something fundamental had shifted in African geopolitics. Three relatively small nations had successfully challenged the entire Western security establishment and emerged stronger for it. April 3, 2025, became a day that exposed the depth of Western panic about developments in the Sahel. U.S. Africa Command Commander Michael Langley sat before the Senate Armed Services Committee in Washington, delivering testimony that revealed just how seriously American military leadership viewed the alliance of Sahel states' threat. For 2 excruciating hours, senators grilled the general about what they saw as America's losing battle for influence in Africa. Langley's testimony was brutally honest about American concerns. The alliance had successfully expelled Western military forces from a strategically crucial region, created alternative partnerships with Russia and China, and inspired sovereignty movements across Africa. Most alarmingly, they had done it all while maintaining popular support and international legitimacy. The general's specific attacks on Captain Traoré revealed the personal nature of Western frustration with the young Burkina Faso leader. Langley accused the captain of using nationalized gold reserves to protect his junta rather than benefit his people, a criticism that exposed the desperate nature of American arguments. The same official simultaneously described North Africa as NATO's southern flank, revealing the alliance's imperial mindset toward the continent. What made Langley's testimony particularly significant was his admission that traditional American soft power tools were failing in Africa. The Trump administration had reduced USAID programs, and China was successfully filling the development assistance void. The alliance's success demonstrated that African nations could achieve sovereignty without American approval or support. Intelligence reports presented to the committee painted an alarming picture for NATO interests. The alliance had successfully mobilized 90,000 civilian volunteers for homeland defense, far exceeding their initial target of 50,000. These weren't just military recruits. They represented a massive popular mobilization for African sovereignty that transcended ethnic and religious divisions. The alliance's military capabilities were growing rapidly through partnerships with non-Western powers. Russian advisors provided training and equipment, while Chinese engineers developed infrastructure projects that served African development priorities. Unlike previous international partnerships, these arrangements included technology transfer and local capacity building. European officials watched the Senate hearing with growing alarm, recognizing that America's Africa strategy was in complete disarray. The alliance had successfully neutralized Western military advantages while building alternative partnerships that served their sovereignty agenda. NATO's entire Africa framework was collapsing in real time. Social media campaigns supporting the alliance had reached global audiences, with African diaspora communities in Europe and America organizing solidarity protests. The narrative of African sovereignty versus Western neocolonialism was resonating far beyond the Sahel, creating international pressure for other African nations to reconsider their relationships with former colonial powers. The alliance's economic policies were proving particularly effective at undermining Western influence. By prioritizing local food production and regional trade, they had reduced dependence on international markets and foreign assistance. Burkina Faso's 2024 agricultural harvest of nearly 6 million tons of cereal demonstrated that African nations could achieve food sovereignty through proper policies. Human Rights Watch and other Western organizations began publishing reports critical of the alliance governments, following the familiar regime change playbook that had been used against independent African leaders for decades. However, these campaigns had limited impact because the alliance enjoyed genuine popular support and international legitimacy. The alliance's response to Western criticism was sophisticated and effective. Rather than engaging in defensive arguments, they highlighted the failures of Western intervention in the region. Statistical evidence showed that terrorism had increased dramatically during the period of international military presence, undermining justifications for continued foreign involvement. NATO strategists were particularly concerned about the alliance's appeal to young Africans, who represented the majority of the continent's population, Traditional Western narratives about democracy and human rights had little resonance with young people who had witnessed the failures of Western-backed governments and the success of the alliance's sovereignty agenda. The alliance's diplomatic strategy was equally impressive. They maintained relationships with international organizations while rejecting Western dominance, participating in African Union activities while building alternative regional frameworks. This approach isolated Western powers rather than isolating the alliance. By mid-2025, Western intelligence agencies were forced to acknowledge that their Africa strategies had failed completely. The Alliance of Sahel States had successfully challenged NATO's southern expansion plans and created an alternative model of African governance that was attracting support across the continent. The testimony before the Senate committee revealed the scale of Western strategic failure. 3 relatively small African nations had successfully expelled major international powers, created alternative partnerships, and inspired sovereignty movements across the continent. NATO's Africa dreams were turning into nightmares. January 28, 2024, marked another historic moment that sent shockwaves through West African capitals and beyond. In a coordinated announcement that demonstrated their unity, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger simultaneously declared their immediate withdrawal from the economic community of West African states. The decision shattered the 50-year-old regional bloc and created a power vacuum that would reshape continental politics. The announcement came after months of deteriorating relationships with ECOWAS leadership, which the 3 alliance members accused of serving foreign interests rather than African sovereignty. The final straw had been the organization's threat of military intervention in Niger, backed by France and other Western powers. For Captain Traoré and his allies, ECOWAS had become a threat to our states rather than a vehicle for African unity. General Abdourahmane Chiani of Niger delivered the most pointed criticism during their joint press conference in Niamey. "We are going to create an AES of the peoples instead of an ECOWAS, whose directives and instructions are dictated to it by powers that are foreign to Africa," he declared. The statement crystallized the fundamental philosophical divide between the alliance and the existing regional order. The economic consequences were immediate and far-reaching. The 3 departing nations represented a significant portion of ECOWAS's land mass and population, controlling crucial trade routes and natural resources. Their withdrawal created new borders and customs arrangements that disrupted regional commerce patterns established over decades. What made this development particularly devastating for Western interests was the coordinated nature of the withdrawal. The 3 governments had spent months preparing alternative trade arrangements and financial mechanisms, demonstrating a level of strategic planning that caught international observers off guard. They weren't just leaving ECOWAS. They were building something entirely new. The alliance's economic vision was revolutionary. Rather than accepting the colonial-era arrangement where African nations exported raw materials and imported finished goods, they planned to develop integrated supply chains and manufacturing capabilities. Burkina Faso's agricultural expertise would feed the alliance, Mali's gold would fund development projects, and Niger's uranium would power energy independence. Captain Traoré had been particularly vocal about the economic injustices that ECOWAS had perpetuated. Despite Burkina Faso's agricultural potential, food insecurity remained a chronic problem because export-oriented policies favored foreign markets over local needs. The alliance promised to prioritize food sovereignty and local consumption before considering international trade. The response from remaining ECOWAS members revealed the deep divisions within West African leadership. While some countries publicly criticized the withdrawal, others privately expressed understanding for the alliance's grievances. The entire regional order was fracturing along generational and ideological lines. Behind the public announcements, the alliance was already implementing practical cooperation measures. Joint military exercises began in border regions, sharing intelligence about jihadist movements and coordinating security responses. Unlike previous international partnerships, these arrangements served African interests exclusively. The alliance's withdrawal from ECOWAS also meant rejecting the CFA franc currency system that had kept francophone African nations tied to French monetary policy. Plans for a new common currency began immediately, designed to serve African development priorities rather than European financial interests. International financial institutions panicked as they realized the implications. The alliance controlled significant mineral wealth and agricultural output, with the potential to create alternative trading relationships that bypass traditional Western commercial networks. Chinese and Russian officials quickly expressed interest in new partnership arrangements. What truly worried Western strategists was the alliance's growing appeal to young Africans across the continent. Social media campaigns supporting the alliance's vision of African sovereignty gained millions of followers, creating pressure on other African governments to reconsider their relationships with former colonial powers. The alliance's leadership had calculated correctly that ECOWAS would struggle to respond effectively. The organization's dependence on Western support and financing limited its options for punishing the departing members. Economic sanctions would hurt remaining ECOWAS countries more than the alliance, which had already prepared alternative arrangements. By March 2025, the alliance took an even bolder step, withdrawing from the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, the international body promoting French language and culture. This symbolic break represented a complete rejection of Francophone identity in favor of a new African consciousness. The withdrawal from ECOWAS had achieved exactly what the alliance leaders intended. They had demonstrated that African unity didn't require foreign approval or Western institutional frameworks. Their success inspired similar sovereignty movements across the continent, creating a domino effect that international powers were struggling to contain. The dusty streets of Ouagadougou buzzed with an energy that hadn't been felt in decades. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, barely 34 years old, stood before his advisors in the presidential palace, his military uniform crisp despite the sweltering West African heat. The young leader had already shaken the world by taking power in September 2022, but what he was about to announce would send shockwaves far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The era of taking orders from distant capitals is over, Traoré declared, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had witnessed too much suffering. Outside, the sounds of daily life continued, but inside the halls of power, history was being written. The captain had grown up watching foreign military bases dot his homeland like unwelcome monuments to dependency. French soldiers patrolled his country's streets claiming to fight terrorism, while the violence only grew worse. For over a decade, international forces had promised security, but delivered chaos. The statistics were damning. Since NATO's intervention in Libya in 2011, terrorist incidents in Burkina Faso had skyrocketed. What was once a peaceful nation ranked 114th on global terrorism. Indices had plummeted to 4th place by 2021. The so-called war on terror had brought nothing but terror to ordinary Burkinabe families. Traoré's advisors spread maps across the mahogany table, pointing to areas where jihadist groups now controlled territory that had been safe just years earlier. The irony was bitter. French Operation Sabre, supposedly designed to combat extremism, had coincided with the worst security crisis in the nation's history. Villages that had known peace for generations now lived under the shadow of violence. The young captain's mind drifted to his modest upbringing in the northern regions, where he had seen firsthand how foreign military presence had failed his people. Despite billions in international aid and military assistance, rural communities remained vulnerable, their young men either fleeing to Europe or falling prey to radical recruitment. The promised prosperity had never materialized, while the country's vast gold reserves continued flowing to foreign accounts. Standing by the window overlooking the capital, Traoré watched ordinary citizens going about their lives, unaware that their leader was contemplating moves that would reshape West African geopolitics. His decision would challenge not just France, but the entire Western security architecture that had dominated the Sahel for generations. The captain had studied military strategy at the War College, but he was about to employ lessons learned from Pan-African heroes like Thomas Sankara and Kwame Nkrumah. What made this moment particularly explosive was Traoré's understanding of the bigger picture. He knew that his counterparts in neighboring Mali and Niger were facing identical challenges, dealing with the same failed foreign interventions and the same broken promises of security. The young captain sensed an opportunity to break free from what he saw as a system designed to keep African nations dependent and divided. The room fell silent as Traoré turned back to his team. His next words would trigger a continental shift that Western intelligence agencies had never seen coming. The captain who lived on a modest military salary while governing a gold-rich nation was about to prove that true leadership didn't require foreign approval or NATO backing. As the sun set over Ouagadougou, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Captain Traoré made his choice. The boy from the northern provinces was ready to challenge an entire global order, and he wasn't planning to do it alone. His phone buzzed with messages from military leaders in Mali and Niger who shared his vision of African sovereignty. The revolution was about to begin, and NATO had no idea what was coming. January 2023 marked the beginning of a seismic shift that would catch European capitals completely off guard. Captain Traoré stood before television cameras in the presidential palace, his message simple but revolutionary. France had 1 month to withdraw all military personnel from Burkina Faso. The 2018 defense agreement that had allowed foreign troops to operate on sovereign Burkinabe soil was officially terminated. The announcement sent immediate shockwaves through Paris, where officials had grown comfortable with their military presence across former colonies. For over a decade, French forces had maintained bases throughout the Sahel under the banner of Operation Sabre, promising to bring stability to the region. Instead, violence had exploded across the territory, with jihadist groups gaining ground year after year. In the streets of Ouagadougou, citizens erupted in celebration. Protesters who had been demanding foreign military withdrawal for months finally saw their voices heard. Young Burkinabe held signs reading, "Our sovereignty is not negotiable and Africa for Africans." The scenes were broadcast across the continent, inspiring similar movements in neighboring countries. Behind closed doors, French military officials scrambled to understand how they had lost control of the narrative so completely. Intelligence reports revealed that popular support for the military government was stronger than anyone in European capitals had anticipated. The young captain had tapped into a deep well of resentment against foreign military presence that had been building for years. Within weeks, the true scope of Traoré's strategic thinking became clear. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. His counterparts in Mali and Niger were watching closely, taking notes on how a small West African nation could successfully challenge major international powers. Secret communications between the three military governments intensified as they recognized they faced identical challenges from the same sources. The economic implications were staggering. Burkina Faso's gold production had reached nearly 6 million tons of cereal in 2024, but the benefits had never reached ordinary citizens. Foreign mining companies, often backed by the same nations providing security, had extracted billions in resources while local communities remained impoverished. Traoré's government began reviewing every mining contract and foreign investment deal signed under previous administrations. What truly terrified Western observers was the captain's systematic approach to achieving genuine independence. He wasn't just expelling foreign troops, he was building alternative partnerships. Russian advisors quietly arrived to discuss security cooperation, while Chinese engineers presented infrastructure development plans that promised to benefit Burkinabe workers directly. By February 2023, French forces completed their withdrawal, marking the end of Operation Sabre. The images of military convoys leaving Burkina Faso were broadcast across Africa, symbolizing the end of an era. For the first time since independence, the country was truly free from foreign military presence, with its security entirely in Burkinabe hands. European Union officials watched in horror as their carefully constructed Sahel strategy crumbled. The withdrawal from Burkina Faso was supposed to be an isolated incident, but intelligence suggested that similar movements were gaining momentum across West Africa. The dominoes were beginning to fall in ways that NATO strategists had never imagined possible. The young captain had achieved something remarkable. In just 4 months, he had successfully challenged the military presence of a major NATO power and won. More importantly, he had demonstrated to the entire continent that African nations didn't need foreign military bases to maintain sovereignty. The psychological impact across the Sahel was immediate and profound. As news of the successful withdrawal spread, African social media exploded with messages of support. Young people across the continent began questioning why their own countries still hosted foreign military bases. The captain from Burkina Faso had started something much bigger than anyone realized. What made the situation even more remarkable was Traoré's personal conduct throughout the crisis. While other leaders lived in luxury, he maintained his modest captain's salary and continued living simply. This authenticity resonated powerfully with ordinary Africans who had grown tired of corrupt leaders enriching themselves while serving foreign interests. The expulsion of French forces was just the beginning. Captain Traoré was preparing moves that would reshape the entire regional security architecture, and his neighbors were eager to join the revolution. July 2025 marked the ultimate vindication of Captain Traoré's vision as the Alliance of Sahel States Confederation became fully operational. The three nations had successfully created alternative institutions, developed independent economic policies, and inspired sovereignty movements across Africa. What had begun as military cooperation had evolved into a comprehensive model for African self-determination. The alliance's success was measured not just in political victories, but in tangible improvements for ordinary citizens. Burkina Faso's agricultural revolution had achieved food security for the first time in decades, while coordinated mining policies ensured that natural resource wealth benefited local communities rather than foreign corporations. The contrast with previous decades of foreign-managed development was stark and undeniable. International observers were forced to acknowledge the alliance's achievements. Despite predictions of economic collapse and security deterioration, the three nations had maintained stability while building new partnerships and institutions. Their success challenged fundamental assumptions about African capacity for self-governance that had justified foreign intervention for generations. The alliance's military strategy proved particularly effective against jihadist threats. By combining local knowledge with popular mobilization, they achieved security improvements that years of international intervention had failed to deliver. The 90,000 civilian volunteers formed effective community defense networks that denied extremist groups the local support they needed to operate. Captain Traoré's personal example had become legendary across Africa. The young leader who continued living on a captain's salary while governing a gold-rich nation embodied the authentic leadership that African youth demanded. His rejection of personal enrichment while pursuing national sovereignty created a powerful model for other African leaders. The alliance's diplomatic achievements were equally impressive. They had successfully navigated international legal frameworks while rejecting Western dominance, maintaining relationships with global institutions while building African alternatives. Their approach demonstrated that sovereignty didn't require isolation or confrontation with the international community. Economic integration within the alliance accelerated throughout 2025, with joint infrastructure projects and coordinated industrial policies creating new opportunities for regional development. Unlike previous regional integration efforts that had been dominated by foreign interests, the alliance prioritized African needs and African solutions. The psychological impact of the alliance's success extended far beyond West Africa. Young Africans across the continent looked to the Sahel as proof that genuine independence was possible in the 21st century. Social media campaigns supporting African sovereignty gained millions of followers, creating pressure for political change across the continent. Western think tanks and policy institutes struggled to understand how their Africa strategies had failed so completely. The alliance had successfully neutralized military superiority, economic leverage, and diplomatic pressure while building alternative partnerships and institutions. Traditional tools of international influence had proven ineffective against determined African sovereignty movements. The alliance's success in challenging NATO's Africa expansion plans had global implications. Other regions experiencing Western military presence watched carefully, learning lessons about resistance strategies and alternative partnership models. The Sahel had become a symbol of successful decolonization that inspired similar movements worldwide. By late 2025, even former critics were forced to acknowledge the alliance's achievements. The three nations had successfully expelled foreign military forces, created independent institutions, achieved economic growth, and maintained popular support. Their model of African sovereignty was attracting interest from across the continent and beyond. Captain Traoré reflected on the journey from his modest office in Ouagadougou, where maps now showed alliance territory as a zone of African sovereignty rather than foreign military bases. The young officer who had dared to challenge global powers had successfully created a new model for African governance that prioritized sovereignty over dependency. The alliance's success story was still being written, but its core achievement was already clear. 3 African nations had successfully broken free from neo-colonial control and created alternatives that served African interests. Their revolution had inspired similar movements across the continent, suggesting that the age of foreign domination in Africa was finally ending. The captain from Burkina Faso had kept his promise. The era of taking orders from distant capitals was indeed over, replaced by a new African dawn based on sovereignty, unity, and self-determination. NATO's southern expansion dreams had been permanently shattered by young African leaders who refused to accept continued foreign dominance. The alliance of Sahel states had achieved something unprecedented in modern African history: genuine independence through unity, determination, and strategic thinking. Their success pointed toward a future where African nations would determine their own destinies without foreign interference or approval.